everybody. This is Pastor John from Millerville Community Church, and this is MCC Briefing. This is part 2 of the Pastor Coates Trial for Freedom. As you might see in the logo here, we are going to be talking about Pastor Coates and his fight with the Alberta government and with governments in general regarding their rights and responsibilities in terms of how he perceives it as a minister and how we understand it as ministers of the gospel of Jesus Christ, speaking to the government, Christian church. Pastor Coates, as you may know, has gone to jail and has served a sentence in refusing bail because he wouldn't sign a document saying that he would not enter his church. That was part of his restrictions for bail, and he wouldn't sign it, and therefore they kept him in jail the whole time. So Pastor Coates was facing some very difficult decisions. Because of that, he's been in jail for some time. Here we've got an article from newspaper saying judge finds released jail GraceLife church pastor's shepherd ought to protect his flock. So last week we heard that Pastor Coates was going to get out on Friday, and then we found out, nope, he's not going to get out. They had dropped the charges all but one, which was going to trial. And then we heard it was going to be a $100 fine. Well, over the weekend, the judge thought about it and so on, and he came back, as this article describes it. And this week, he decided that a $100 fine would not be enough, and that it would encourage other churches to make a difference in terms of them opening up. If it was just a $100 fine, all the churches would open up. That was his thinking. So he increased the fine to a significant amount of $1,500. And then he turned around and he said the fine was paid by time served. Mr. Coates was in jail because he refused to sign a document saying he would not enter his church again. And he said, there's no fee, you've already paid it because of time served. And so Pastor Coates is off the hook. He was going to pay $100 cash, and now he's not paying anything. But his hands were slapped and he was scolded by the judge. So now what do? You've gotten out of jail, and well, are you? Well, the good news is he did get out of jail. We were pleased to announce that's exactly what took place, and when he got out of jail, he was greeted by his family, and they were so glad to see him after this long time that he had been in there working hard to get him out with his lawyers. And he was in solitary confinement for COVID restrictions for a good period of time, as you can tell from this video. They're very pleased to see their dad and their husband again, and we are glad to see him out of jail. This brave man made a great deal of sacrifices. So did his family, so did his church, because he stood on a principle. And it's heartbreaking to see that he had to go through this. And how do we get into this situation in the first place? What is this controversy about? And why did he feel like he had to make this stand? Well, that's what we want to explore today as we consider Pastor Coates on trial for his freedom and for our freedoms as well, and whether the government has the right to dictate to churches what they can and cannot do under the guise of a medical health crisis. And that's the challenge we have today. Well, as a minister, I've been privileged to be a part of what they call a town hall, where we as ministers are contacted by our district, and we get on a phone call, and on that phone call we are with the Premier, Kenny, as well as the doctor for the province, Henshaw, and they discuss the current situations, and they encourage us to cooperate with them. And they tell us and give us update about the numbers and so on. So before I take on any other position and discuss Pastor Coates' position and so on, I want to give fair voice to them. So I was granted a recording of this interview given to me by the Alberta government because I wasn't able to be on the line the whole time, and they sent me a recording. Didn't record it myself. This was sent to me. This is their government website. The town hall was an open meeting for us to ask questions and to get answers, and that's exactly what they did. So, Kenny, now the audio recording I've got for you today is not the greatest. It's kind of garbled because the Premier was in his car as he traveling as this town hall took place. But in that, we had the distinct impression that Kenny thinks that some pastors, just a few, are bad actors and are not behaving in a safe way. And he was encouraging us to continue to follow lockdown rules and regulations of the Alberta government and not be like the few bad actors. This would include Coates and taking the Alberta government to trial for their position. So here's our Premier on this.
To a couple of your points. Pastor, this is not a flu. And you're doing your congregants, quite frankly, a disservice if you're telling them it is a flu. In an average year, about 80 Albertans die from the flu. So far, 1,900 Albertans have died in 1 year from COVID-19, despite extraordinary measures. So this is 20 times more lethal than the flu, despite the extraordinary measures. This is a novel coronavirus, which is a pandemic, which is highly virulent and lethal, especially for vulnerable people. So when you say it's a flu, we all know what you're trying to do, which is to deny the reality of this pandemic. And I frankly don't think that's responsible leadership. It has some influenza-like characteristics for sure, communicable respiratory diseases and similar seasonality and interventions can be effective on both, but they're nowhere close to each other in terms of their lethality. And that's why extraordinary measures have had to be taken, not just in Alberta, James, but every single part of the world. So if you think Alberta is kind of out of line here, I'd invite you to look at jurisdictions all around the world. The truth is that, generally speaking, our restrictions have been less stringent than the vast majority of jurisdictions in the Western world. In East Asia, they took a totally different approach, basically shutting their borders and hard quarantines. But let me share with you that right now, it's illegal to walk into a church or a temple in British Columbia, in most parts of Ontario, in all of Quebec, in Manitoba. There's a maximum of 30 people who can gather in a place of worship in Saskatchewan. So by Canadian standards, I mean, James, you talk about supposedly enforcement agents that are snooping around places of worship. I've been going to church throughout the pandemic, churches that follow the guidelines very carefully because they care about human life, they care about the vulnerable. And what I've seen there is I haven't seen any snitches. There is no snitch line. There's always been an Alberta Health Services line to report violations of public health guidelines. That's pre-existed COVID, but there's no COVID-related, quote, snitch line. And no bureaucracy has been weaponized. In fact, I would say Alberta's taken a very light approach to implementing the measures, sanctioning the measures. I believe in the whole year, there's only been something like 2,000 tickets written based on violations of COVID violations, and most of those have been irresponsible individual actions. Generally speaking, the enforcement agencies have tried with education. When that hasn't worked, they've worked with businesses or organizations to comply, and they've only used fines or sanctions as a very last resort. So I think the expression of weaponization of the bureaucracy is a little bit of hyperbole.
So the caller there was saying that the government was weaponizing COVID, and he was calling them on it, and it also mentioned it was a flu. He repeats this many times that to call it a flu is irresponsible. He talks about bad actors out there, and there's only been a few, but that they're acting irresponsibly and putting people at risk. And then he goes on to say that his position and the government that he takes has been pretty light-handed, telling congregations to reduce to 15% of capacity of fire marshal, initially completely shut down, as it is in British Columbia, and some draconian rules and as we have seen in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So he basically says, I'm not as bad as them, and compared to what's happened worldwide, we've been more than fair with congregations. So understand what he's saying. He's measuring whether he has a level-handed approach and whether he's in the right by comparing himself to other governments and seeing what they're doing. And by that standard, he feels like he's okay, that he's doing all right. Maybe not as good as some, but better than most. And therefore, he should get a pass. He says that it's not a flu, that there are 80 of the 1,900 deaths in Alberta were due to COVID-19, is his argument. There is 20 times more lethal than a flu, that you're 20 times more likely to die of COVID-19 than you are of a flu. So it's not responsible to call it a flu, and we shouldn't behave that way. And because it's so lethal and because it's very dangerous, extraordinary measures were required, including the violation of our civil rights, freedom to travel, a right of religion, and maybe even a free speech and protest. And 2,000 tickets to irresponsible individuals have been issued. So he believes every ticket was justified, although he had no direct connection with those tickets. But he believes if you got a ticket, you must have been irresponsible. So that's his position. That's what he believes. And he encourages us then to be concerned about deaths that could occur from this.
Sadly, we've lost over 1,900 lives in this province, and that's despite the extraordinary measures that have been taken. I mean, just to put that in perspective, it's pretty clear that we will likely exceed 10% of the average annual deaths for all causes just related to this one disease, and of course millions worldwide.
So he's quoting more figures, saying 10% of our deaths here in Alberta are going to be due to COVID, and therefore it's a serious problem. Therefore, the extraordinary measures is needed. And he argues COVID is very real, and pastors and irresponsible people are arguing that COVID is not real, and all congregations conform and need to conform with this, and that's what he goes on to say in this next clip.
Let me just close with one last point, because I know there's been a handful of congregations in the Christian tradition which have we're only aware of 2 or 3 that have sort of flagrantly refused to try to comply with any of the public health measures whatsoever. And it seems to be their position that COVID is not real, the pandemic should not be taken very seriously, and that they have an absolute right against any government restriction of their facilities. Well, I just want to point out that a couple of things. First of all, obviously, every place of worship conforms with a wide range of dozens or even hundreds of government regulatory requirements. The fire code, capacity limit itself, all sorts of building codes, employment laws that you have to comply with. I mean, there's the law of the land does not stop at the door of a church or a temple. We unqualifiedly respect freedom of religion, freedom of conscience in this province. We unfortunately have had to change the way that congregational worship is done. But I just want to share with you, as a person of faith myself, my own reflection, which is this. I believe every faith tradition that shares the golden rule that we should love others as we would have, that we should treat others as we would have them treat us, or we should love others as we would have them love us. This is not a principle of radical individualism or autonomy. This is a principle of caring for others. This is the biblical mandate for those who come from the tradition of the book, to care for the vulnerable, to protect the vulnerable. And so that is, I think, a call on people of faith that I think the vast majority of communities have respected, and I want to thank you for that. And with that, I think we'll turn it over to Dr. Hinshaw.
So, interesting argument the Premier has made there. He's making the argument that COVID is real, and it is not right to ignore that and to take responsibility for that. All congregations to hundreds of rules, he said. It's like we have fire regulation rules, and we have accounting rules, and churches have to follow those rules all the time. So when they pass a health restriction rule, and then force us to change our worship. So now you have the government saying, this is how you must worship. You can't sing, you can't do this, you can't, and all these regulations coming down. So they're not just making sure that our buildings are safe from fire, they're actually telling us how we'll worship. And that's going a bridge too far, I think, in terms of civil responsibility and normal rule making for normal procedures for other churches and for other buildings, because fire regulations apply to everything. But now worship doesn't apply to Costco or Walmart, it applies to churches, and very specifically they've targeted churches. So even though health restrictions in terms of washing your hands, and whether you have too many people in the building for square footage and enough fire exits, I get that. That's normal for all businesses across the board. But when you start saying to churches specifically, you can't worship this way anymore, you must worship this way, and we are telling you how you will worship, and then you have to ask yourself, well, does that edict from a health standpoint violate the Charter of Rights, and whether they're able to do that? It's one thing to ask for cooperation, and it's another thing to legislate our cooperation. And that's the difference here. So he goes to the Golden Rule, and it says people of faith all over the world kind of observe the Golden Rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, to love your neighbor as yourself. And then he encourages us to behave that way. The difference with the teaching of Jesus Christ, when it said, love your neighbor as you love yourself, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which we all learned in Sunday school if you have attended church, was that it was a voluntary encouragement by Jesus Christ for us to consider how we live our personal lives. It wasn't a law. But now what we've done, and this isn't the only case where this has taken place, because we have decided that rather than ask people and encourage them and appeal to their moral standards, we are telling them, you will obey the Golden Rule. You will do this out of concern, and if you don't, you will pay hefty financial fines. And if you still don't conform, and then you could be arrested and detained and be sentenced and stand trial for your crimes because you didn't follow the Golden Rule. Well, there's something contradictory to that, because doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, Jesus didn't come to preach rule keeping and law forced on lawbreakers. In fact, he came preaching grace and peace, and he said there are lawbreakers around you, but you aren't going to stop them by creating more laws. You're just going to break more laws. He said what the change needs to occur is in our hearts and not through law. But Kenny knows the law and the power of the government, and he says we're going to do this by law. and take it away from them. So we have to ask ourselves if this is really justification. So the upshot of this all is that Kenny is arguing that his behavior has been largely determined by the behavior of other provinces, and on the whole, he thinks he's doing pretty good. I have to agree, he's not cracking down on us as hard as other provinces and other places in the world. But just because I don't live under a dictatorship in another part of the world or part of Canada doesn't mean that I agree with a soft dictatorship or principle in place. They would argue then that, well, the science shows that we're justified in protecting the Albertans from the catastrophe of the health problem. And therefore, we need to conform for the good of others because the science says so. And he quotes death rates and how disastrous this could all be. He goes on in this next section of talking about the Brother Coates, because one of the ministers in this call asked him about Coates and whether he was going to be released. And of course, the Premier can't speak directly to that because of a court case. But here's his reply.
Okay, thank you, Pastor. I have to be careful about what I say because there's a principle that if your emphasis shouldn't be commenting on that before the court. I'll just offer you. You asked why is he in jail? Why is he released? You would have to ask the pastor that. Because both the Crown Prosecutor's Service and the court, Queen's Bench, have repeatedly confirmed to Pastor Coates and his counsel that he is absolutely free to go at any time. Of course, that means be released on bail conditions, which he refuses to confirm. And the bail conditions are very simply that he will respect the law, follow the law. There is a myth out there that he is being told he's not allowed to preach. That is complete fiction. Anybody can preach anywhere in Alberta, and no one is restricted from preaching. He's been asked us by the court, not by the government, by the court, by a judge, by the independent judiciary, to make an undertaking as a condition of release that he would respect the law. There are 10,000 clergy roughly in Alberta, according to Statistics Canada, and as far as we can tell, 10,000 of them have respected the law. And nobody is above the law, not me, not a pastor. And it's the job of the court, not the government, to ensure that the law is respected and that people's rights are respected at the same time, of course. I shared, Pastor, I'll just add to this, that I think I'm the only premier in Canada who has spoken publicly and repeatedly about the need for us at this time to be very, very reluctant to abridge or impair in any way fundamental freedoms that we bring to the Canadian Constitution. The first one of which, of course, is freedom of religion and conscience. And that is why, frankly, we continue to have congregational worship in Alberta within certain parameters. It is why we have avoided the extremes of most other provinces completely suspending places of worship. Just let me give you a quick description of the jurisprudence, the constitutional law that the courts look at on issues like this. Section 1 of the Constitution says that these rights apply except where an abridgment of the right is demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. The limitation that these public health measures impose on worship gatherings, we believe, are clearly demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society because they're applied in a proportionate way with a legitimate policy goal, which is to protect lives and prevent widespread transmission of a deadly virus. So you're right, that issue probably will be taken up in the court, but I'll tell you this much. Alberta, I believe, will stand head and shoulders above any other province the constitutional test of how we dealt with these difficult issues.
So the Premier is quite proud of his position. He says compared to every other province and throughout the country, he's standing head and shoulders above the rest because he has defended our constitutional rights under the Constitution and has not overly violated our civil rights. He is dictating worship practice, when and how, and we practice what we can do and what we cannot do. He's dictating those things, but not as bad as others, as continues to be his argument. He was specifically asked about Pastor Coates, who went to jail, and his response is basically that Pastor Coates can be free anytime. He said that Pastor Coates has to sign a directive from the court saying that he'll respect the law. And this agreement would be that it's called an undertaking, and that he would sign it, and then he could be free. And all he's signing is saying to respect the law. But in reality, what he doesn't say is well known, and we'll hear from his lawyer later that tells us this, is that the undertaking specifically said Pastor Coates would not be allowed to enter his church, his own church, and to meet with his people at his church. He said, I can't sign that. I'm a pastor. I have to meet with my people. And because he wouldn't agree to stay away from his congregation, he went to jail. That was the main reason, because he couldn't agree to that undertaking as a condition of his bail. And because he couldn't agree to that, he was willing to sign and admit he broke the law, he broke the undertaking, he was willing to pay the fine, but he could not agree to stay away from his congregation. That's why he was put in jail, because he would not agree to that. Now, he said 10,000 other clergy across Alberta are all obeying and not going to jail. And that's because none of us 10,000 other pastors have been asked to sign an undertaking, say that we wouldn't agree that we could not enter our churches anymore. We've have agreed to modifying our worship services as dictated by the government, and later on, Henshaw talked about it and the confusion that surrounds even the rules they're telling us. And we're always asking for clarity on these things, and they just don't make sense, some of them. But none of us have been asked to stay away from our congregations. If you came to us, and any one of us pastors, and say, would you sign this agreement agreeing never to enter your church again? Would you sign it? And I would say that a great majority of those 10,000 clergy would say, no way, I'm not going to sign that. And off to jail we would go. That's the only difference. Pastor Coate was given that. He refused to sign it. I bet a lot of us pastors in our province would refuse to sign it as well, and also go to jail. Who knows? We might get that opportunity in the near future. He says that no one is above the law, and no one is above the Constitution either. So can you violate the rights of our rights under the Constitution and say no one is above the law? Well, that's an interesting argument that we will let the courts decide later on. Because the courts are trying to decide whether he has just cause. The whole idea is that they are justified in doing this because we have a health crisis. And this health crisis justifies, he literally said there, the violating of our civil rights. And they have just cause, and they can do that. So this assertion is made over in order to show that they have just cause. They talk about churches being super spreaders. He was asked why churches are treated differently than shopping at Walmart or Costco is a favorite expression. And he says, well, both here and abroad in Canada and around the world, we see that congregations and places of worship and religion tend to spread the COVID virus much more than other groups and businesses and even restaurants. And therefore, we have to be very careful about allowing you guys, you religious people, gathering together because you are super spreaders. That's his position. And he cites his favorite example of the Ethiopian Orthodox congregation in Edmonton. Here's that.
We understand the ongoing sacrifices of faith communities in having limited congregational worship, and the inconvenience of some of the public health measures, but they are helping to keep people safe. We need to remember that last year we did see a number of super spreader events in the province emanating from worship settings, which did take a number of lives and caused wider spread community transmission. And if you're ever frustrated by or skeptical about the need for these measures, I encourage you to talk to, for example, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo congregation in Calgary that lost a number of their congregants and had many, many members of their community in hospital and in ICU for weeks. I mention that not to single them out because they've been very, very eager to cooperate with the measures ever since then, but that's one of many churches that have had great losses because of the pandemic. And I visited them and I hold them up in prayer and just point to them as a reference for a community that frankly tells us they wish they had been more alert to the public health measures last fall before it hit their congregation.
So I've heard this example many times where he talks about this Ethiopian Orthodox congregation in Edmonton and the great losses they experienced. They were super spreaders. And his argument is that they're trying to protect all of us from experiencing the same thing, and saying this congregation wished they had known better and had taken better precautions. Well, Pastor Coates is the issue here in terms of being released from jail, and this is what he wants the trial for, is because he wants to take this to court. Pastor Coates' church has not extremist people. They had shut down the same way everybody had shut down at the beginning, and then they opened up cautiously, following the rules, masks and all that. But in his congregation, as with some of us have, he had people on the front line services and professionals who were observing what was taking place. And they began to realize that the COVID wasn't as big of an issue as made out by the premier, specifically about the Ethiopian Orthodox, but that there was a big issue in that the shutdown policies that were taking place was causing more harm to people through suicide, loss of work, and many other stresses in our lives. And so this good shepherd, Pastor Coates, said, I have to take care of my flock. And if that means opening up the church, then that's what we need to do. So they did. And in fact, they've been open and practicing. And if you wanted to be safe and behind plexiglass, wear a mask and do all that kind of stuff, there was a section of the church that was made available for you to do that very same thing. So it wasn't that they were ignoring or calling it a flu. They said it's a very real thing, and if you feel at risk, then take these measures. And if you feel like you're sick and you have the problem, stay away and don't come around. But for the most part, they made it as available as they could to the congregations that felt like there wasn't a problem and were looking for herd immunity and so on. And what took place is that months and months and months, with the government watching everything else, they met without distancing and masks in the main hall to those who felt comfortable doing so, and there was no spread of the virus. There was a period of time in which the virus did take root in some parts of their community, just outside of Edmonton, Alberta, and they actually shut the church down during that time for a period of time, 2 weeks, to make sure that it was okay, and then they reopened. But there was no cases in their congregation. Now, I feel sorry for the Ethiopian church that experienced loss of life due to COVID, but Pastor Coe's church is a real life example of a church that didn't experience. So there's a corollary here and an antidotal, which is just because you have it in one case doesn't mean you're going to have it in every case. That there might be other variables at play that determine whether one group receives a negative impact as a result of COVID-19 and another group does not. And I think Pastor Coates' church has pretty much proven that to be true. So to treat all congregations the same and say just shut her down across the board without any science to back it was a violation of our civil rights that was done on theory and speculation and anecdotal evidence about a few congregations. Now I can understand. I'll give them a break. Early on, they didn't know what was going on. You do what you can. But as time went on, it didn't treat every group the same, and maybe there are other factors at play. But rather than deal with that reality, they just simply went with the laws that were established and put in place and the rules and applied it just carte blanche to everyone. And therefore, the violation of our civil rights and freedom of religion did take place. Maybe not as bad as other places, but it did take place and is taking place across our country based on the same principle. It doesn't matter whether you're as bad as others not. They're all doing it on the same basis of fear, and in response to it, to just shut her down and don't do anything, when in reality, that's not the case. Part of that was a response of not listening to what's happening on the front line, but trying to manage a crisis from above. And we do have emergency response protocols in place, and one of the basic principles is always to be responsive to frontline workers and what's going on. And I'm afraid that in this case, both the Premier and the province and the medical people are not responding to first-line responders, including churches and pastors who are on the front line of this, dealing with people directly, are saying it's not what you say it is. It's not what you're arguing, and our response is causing harm rather than good. We would like the Premier to hear that argument, and apparently he is not hearing that. The reason Pastor Coates openly violated the rules of the government is because of that. And they practice what we call civil disobedience. And it's not disrespect to the law. But when the government and the law and the medical officials no longer want to be in dialogue about these things or listen to their arguments, the only recourse we have left is the courts. And so a trial is going to take place in which Pastor Coates and his lawyer are going to present a case arguing that there isn't a just cause for the violation of our civil rights under religion, freedom of speech and practice, freedom to gather, freedom to travel, that the whole situation is probably not as bad as perceived. Not that it's just a flu or anything, but there is a real serious issue with COVID-19, but our response to it is probably not the right response. We'll give them a break in terms of the early response, but now we know better, and we need to behave differently. And as everything, we're asking for dialogue. Let's talk. Let's make sense. But if we can't have that conversation and all we get is threats, jail time, and fines if we don't comply, the conversation is getting hindered a great deal. So the conversation is going to court. And so the lawyers have to step in to make the argument. And that case is coming out. The one charge that was not dropped means that the government now must defend their case before an Alberta court that they have just cause for violating our religious liberties. Well, that's going to be a really interesting court case. I want to give you an early taste of what it's like by sharing with you the lawyers that are representing Pastor Coates and the arguments that they're going to make. Here's the lawyer for Pastor Coates was being interviewed. This was 8 weeks into jail with Pastor Coates. At this point, the lawyer Pastor Coates was not released yet, but they were working towards his release and were successful, as we now know. But he was making some excellent points in this interview. And if you've missed this interview, I just want to share bits of it with you so that you can hear his position. And this is the lawyer.
If we proceed with that, and if we're successful, we would like to get him out of jail sooner. So that's under consideration right now. Otherwise, this is a pastor who's been in jail since February the 16th, already more than 2 weeks, and now for another 8 weeks in jail for not being willing to comply with unscientific and unconstitutional health orders, in respect to which the Alberta government has put forward no evidence that the health orders are serving the interests of public safety. This is an assumption that the judge was operating on this morning, and I'm not making the claim that he was incorrect in law, but certainly very sad when you've got governments that are not providing science or evidence to back up these health orders, and they're engaging in fear-mongering. And then now we've got a pastor in jail for not being in full compliance with the unconstitutional health orders.
So he's arguing it's unscientific. No evidence was presented. Just stories about churches that had some problems, but no scientific evidence behind it, and it's unconstitutional in how he implemented. The assumptions that are made without any evidence to the contrast. So now they're going to have to present a case, the lawyer says. We're going to have to try it. So follow science, that's the argument, and so we're going to see if they have the science and if they have a case to make. Fear is the main motivation here, he says, for the lockdown, and that is not justified in his mind. The lawyer that is representing him goes on to say that congregations that violate, and what you heard the Premier said, a few bad actors, according to the way they're being treated by violating Alberta Health Services standards, is equal to murderers, and it rises to the level of being a danger to society. One of the reasons that Pastor Coates is in jail is because he was considered a danger to society if he was allowed to enter his church. That's the argument that's being made, that he was a threat. His actions, this one bad actor would actually cause people to lose their lives. And that, I think, is over the top. It isn't that he was told not to preach, he was told not to enter the building. Well, how are you going to preach to your congregation if you're not in your building? I guess you could sit in your living room and record it and send it out that way. But as we all know, that is not the same as going to a live service and being there with your people. So he was definitely being punished for what he's doing, and he was being perceived as a threat to society. So let's hear about that.
Of Jason Kenney's government right now in the UCP is that if you violate one of these unconstitutional health orders, that you are just as much of a threat to society as a murderer or a rapist. That is the ideology of the government right now, and Pastor Coates is paying the price for that ideology. The silver lining on the cloud is that we do have a trial date, May 3rd to May 5th, and for the first time ever, the Alberta government, after violating our charter rights and freedoms for almost 12 months now, for the first time the government's going to have to show the public some evidence. They're going to have to prove before the court that COVID is an unusually deadly killer, which is something they've been telling us. But I mean, Statistics Canada tells us that the death rates in Canada in 2020 were very much in line with the death rates in 2019, 2018, 2017. The government's going to have to put forward evidence to support its theory that healthy asymptomatic people are significant spreaders of the virus. They're going to have to show us the science. They can't just claim that. The government's going to have to show us the science on the PCR tests, which are unreliable, which were never intended to diagnose COVID, and which have false positive rates as high as 90%. The government's going to have to justify in court why they are choosing to rely on these PCR tests. The government's going to have to show in court that the lockdowns have actually achieved some good. Now, that's easy to claim. You hear politicians all the time telling us, well, if it wasn't for these lockdowns, way more people would have died. Well, I'm sorry, that's speculation. That's just an assertion. They're going to have to back up that assertion in court. The government's going to be having to answer for all of the lockdown harms in court. All they're doing now is kind of making some cooing, sympathetic noises about how hard this must be for people that have lost their jobs. But the government's going to have to show in court that the lockdowns are doing more good than harm. So the silver lining on the cloud is that because of the suffering of Pastor Coates, the government's going to be forced to show the public the science and the evidence for the first time ever. Because all we've had in the last 12 months is fear-mongering and speculation and assertions. And the government doesn't have the evidence, and they're going to have to scramble hard in the next 2 months to come up with it.
Yeah. So here's the good news. I would have an issue with calling Pastor Coates a bad actor, that he's got wrong motives and he's grandstanding or something like that, or that he's risking our lives by wanting to re-enter his congregation and meet with his people. I don't think he is. If you heard his sermon that he gave, and I talked about it in our last episode of MCC Briefing, about why he was doing this, it was to continue the conversation with the government, saying this isn't what you say it is, and what we're doing is not good. It is causing harm, real harm, and people are losing their lives because of the way we're behaving and are put under great stress, both in their marriages and their families and their finances and their careers and jobs, because of the way we are behaving, and we need to change. And because the government doesn't want to dialogue on that and talk about that with us, but just shut us down and fine us and threaten us, the only recourse that is left is the court. So that's not a bad actor. That's a person in the community saying, I want to have this conversation with you, and by gum, we're going to have it. I'm going to use the courts to have this conversation to make the case. What we have in here is the interest of everybody, and that we are treated well so that we can all prosper and do better. And be level-headed about our response to a crisis, because we have not been level-headed about this crisis. We have reacted in fear and in panic, and not all our decisions have been sound decisions. And this isn't just here in Alberta. This is all over the world. And we hope that our government leaders will be responsive and listen and get back to the table, and let's talk. Let's reason together about what is best for everybody and how we handle this situation. We're not looking for sympathy. We are looking for real change and real science, and not just stories and assumptions about what is taking place out there. Now, Pastor Coates went to jail because he wouldn't sign a bail agreement, had been held in jail, and he's in jail serving a time for something that had no jail sentence to it, which is kind of a bizarre situation.
There's no jail time as penalty for for violating these unscientific and unconstitutional public health orders.
So why is he in jail? How did it ever get to that point that the judge decided that he would be there? Well, the judge was under the impression that there was science, that there was just cause to jail him, and that he posed a threat to society. So what would you do? Would you have the courage to stand up for what you believe in? And that's what moments like this with Pastor Coates brings about. Are you willing to make a stand for your rights and for others whose rights are being threatened, both in livelihood and owning a business and running it, and your religion and freedom of speech and all these things? Would you be willing to pay the price if your rights were violated? Well, your rights are being violated. And do you have the courage to stand up and stand with Pastor Coates?
I think it's highly unlikely that I would ever be in jail for committing a criminal offense, but I do sometimes ask myself the question, would I be willing to go to jail for exercising my charter freedoms of speech and expression and religion and conscience and association and peaceful assembly? I would hope that I would have the same courage that Pastor Coates is currently displaying and that he's displaying every day. Yeah. He can get out of jail on a moment's notice if he's willing to violate his conscience and comply with unscientific and unconstitutional health orders. I would only hope that I would have the courage that he is displaying currently, if ever it came to that for myself. I would only hope that I would have that level of courage.
Yeah.
So do we have that kind of courage? Will we stand with Pastor Coates? There is a ideology at play here. When science is not directing our decision making and making rational choices, then what is going on here? Well, what informs us is our worldview and our ideologies. And that's part of what we've been asserting, is that the church, the Christian church, and pastors who serve their congregations on the front line do have a certain worldview and perspective that is not always, and I would dare say often, in disagreement with government, because government is moving more and more to a secular, no God allowed perspective. But when you have that, you lose the wisdom of scriptures and the Bible and God. You know, this isn't the first time the world has ever dealt with a pandemic or a disaster. The Christian church has, along with the Jewish faith, has survived so many of them over thousands of years, and we have accumulated wisdom and understanding of how to go through these tragedies of life. We know it up front in personal lives as we walk with people through crises in their life, but also as we have lived through them down through the centuries, over a millennium now. And the Bible contains all this wisdom about how people have dealt with this in the past. And it is now needed more than ever. And it is important to have a dialogue with religious leaders and with communities and have a sane discussion about an appropriate response to things like this. Well, what is the ideology of the pro-lockdown groups?
So we've got two things at play. One is we've got the ideology of Jason Kenney as well as Rachel Notley. I mean, the UCP and the NDP, they're both pro-lockdown parties. So we've got an ideology here that says that a full church is as much of a threat to the public as murderers that are on the loose. But then we also have and I don't want to tempt the powers that be, but you've got an inconsistent application of that ideology insofar as if Sheila Gunn Reid has been at the church and the church is packed, then logically the government should send in 1,000 police officers and just arrest everybody there. And I don't know if Jason Kenney's willing to go that far, but there's certainly an inconsistency here that I haven't been at the church. I'm in Calgary, a 3-hour drive away. But if you tell me that Sheila Gunn Reid has been there and it's packed, and I take that to be true, then you've got supposedly this big public health risk that is continuing. So it's just disgraceful. This is the consequence of people blindly accepting whatever politicians tell them, and just blindly grasping for this illusion of safety, when the hard data, the Alberta Health Services data, Statistics Canada data, tells us that COVID is not an unusually deadly killer, and it's not something that everybody should be afraid of. And it would just make far more sense to protect the vulnerable, which is, if you're 82 years old and you're sick and you're elderly and you're in a nursing home and you already have, cancer, emphysema, heart disease, what have you, then those are the people that we should be protecting. But to violate our human dignity and our human rights and our fundamental freedoms by, not being allowed to have your parents over for Christmas dinner, it's just it's just appalling, and things will get worse as long as the public is complacent and continues to buy into this fear mongering that is just not grounded on facts.
Yeah.
Following fear is always a bad decision. What this lawyer didn't realize, he says it doesn't make sense that the pastor is in jail, Hannah's in ordered to not to return to his church, but his church continued to meet. Elders took over, associates, and they kept meeting, and nothing changed. Putting the pastor in jail didn't change anything. And he said, to be consistent, you should go down and arrest the congregation. And he didn't want to tempt fate, but he did, because they were listening to that. And following that interview, it wasn't long after that the congregation then, as a congregation, was fined for meeting. It wasn't just Pastor Coates. They went and fined the congregation as in violation of Alberta Health Services. Well, thank you, lawyer. Got them to notice that so they could argue, oh, no, we're being fair. So they did that after the lawyer said that in that interview. So they're paying attention to these interviews and what is being said, which I hope they're paying attention to, but they're not paying attention to the part that matters, to the problem that's at the core of this thing. Why aren't they responding to that, to the science, the making the argument? I guess we have to wait for the court case. My fear is that they're going to drop this before it gets to court because they'll realize they don't have a case. What is my fear of that is because that's what they've done with restaurants who refused to close and stayed open, and they had court case lined up. They were going to go to court to fight it, and then they dropped the case. We don't want them to drop the case. We want this to go to court. We want this to be tried because this is the only way we're getting this conversation going, and to see their just foundation for their argument for the violation of civil rights. He goes on to talk about other things about the prosecutor, and I really don't want to be distracted by that. But I do want to show the difficulties that are present here, because one of the things that are taking place is you have people, even though the premier is Catholic, attends a Catholic church, he really doesn't understand, and nor does the health officials understand how congregations operate or what churches are like, especially Protestants. And by the way, just so that you understand the difference between Catholic and Protestants, Protestants, the root word is a breakaway from the Catholic Church, are those who protest against the mainline churches and saying you're doing wrong. And Martin Luther in the Great Reformation was a protester and therefore a Protestant. And he was protesting against the position. And here we are, Protestants again, protesting. It is part of our faith tradition to speak to power, even at the thread of our own lives. Martin Luther stood before a Catholic court and said, God help me, here I stand. I can do no other. Even though you don't like what I'm saying, still I've got to stand here. That he argued that we are saved by faith and not that of works, lest any man should boast. And that's where he made his stand, a former Catholic monk. And now we have Pastor Coates protesting, stand before the court, say, I know you don't like what I'm saying, and you don't appreciate it, and that's all right, but here I am before your court to make my case, just like Protestants have always for thousands of years. And so that's why Protestants are different. But even their handling of the pastor and the finding of the pastor, the jailing of the pastor, they figure if we get the pastor in trouble, then the church will shut down. But that's not how Protestant churches work. The pastors you can jail them, you can arrest them, but the congregations roll on because they know and they're born again and they're part of that lively faith. The pastor is the shepherd, but he isn't the boss of the church. Who's the boss of the church? Jesus Christ is the boss of the church. They're doing what they believe that their Lord Jesus Christ commands them to do, which is to gather, to worship, and to praise the Lord, and to be respectful and respect their elders and to respect governments and so on, but also to speak the truth and to follow what is right in the eyes of God. And they have prayed and they have sought the Lord and they've talked to scientists and doctors, and they are believing they are doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord. So you better have a good argument, which I guess we'll get when we get finally around to the lawyers. Now, let's talk about Alberta Health Services and Dr. Henshaw, just to illustrate just how there's a misunderstanding. A part of this town hall meeting was trying to get clarity about all the rules that we have. And I got to tell you, we go over the rules and the rules change and we got to go update. And we're trying to make sense of it all. And it's not easy and it isn't consistent. So we ask for guidance oftentimes to get clarification. And part of it is last summer here at MCC and other places, we had outdoor services. Went off well, a lot of churches did it, no spread of COVID. It was great. And then winter came and we all went indoors, and then our numbers had to drop to 15% of fire marshal regulations. Well, a lot of us did that. We didn't like it, but we did it. Here at MCC, we went live stream, and we started doing smaller groups during the week in the church and so on, and did whatever we could to keep moving forward. We used a lot of Zoom, and I got to tell you, there's no replacing gathering together in the body of Christ. And we know that because at our worship services, you have to pre-register, so we have contact tracing and all that. And that fills up, boom, right away. Boy, if you want to get in, you got to sign in right away. We also now have a policy, if you tried to get in and you didn't get in, you're automatically signed up for next week so that you could be first in line rather than last in line. So we're trying to do this, but we're all thinking spring. Here we are in March and approaching the end of it. One last snowstorm just hit us, but we're thinking spring's right around the corner, and we are dreaming of going back to the outdoor services. That worked so well, and the COVID wasn't spreading, and we had social distancing, and we worshiped outdoors. But now we are being told, oh no, you can't do that. You cannot go to outdoor services.
I will say about Karen Thorsrud, though, that perhaps she believes in sincerely that she...
Sorry for that. I want to go to Dr. Henshaw talking about outdoor services. This is what I wanted you to hear. And there's no sound. Well, how do you like that?
Thank you. And there have been some events that have taken place in the last little while where organizers have put together a plan to ensure that there's appointments to limit the number of people in any one space at any given time, and kind of put through a protocol that does ensure that people are being spaced and kept apart. I guess it would depend on the type of event that you're considering, but we do still cap an outdoor social event at 10 people. So if you're considering an event where people are all coming together for the purpose of, watching a performance or listening to a speaker or something like that, then there would be a cap on the numbers right now in terms of the number of people that could come and attend. But if you're talking about setting up a display or something where people could come by and look at it at a pre-booked appointment time, then that's the kind of thing that could take place. Whether or not that would have the effect that you would wish in terms of encouraging people, as I completely agree, this has been an incredibly difficult year, and many people are really tired of carrying that burden that they've been carrying for a long time. So I would encourage you in the next couple of months to think of ways that you can encourage each other and lift each other up as we work to get, again, the greatest number of people receiving vaccines so that we are able to get back into something that is more like what we were used to a year and a half ago. But in the meantime, again, it would really depend on the way that outdoor event was organized and how many people were going to be present at any given time. And it would have to follow all the protocols, which right now do cap the number of people at an outdoor social gathering to only 10.
So here's the problem, is if it's a gathering of people outdoors, it's a social gathering. But we're trying to tell her, no, it's an outdoor worship service. It's not an outdoor gathering for social purposes. It's not a social gathering. It is specifically a worship service outdoors. But somehow she's not getting that point. So I talked to my own leaders about this, as many of us pastors have. So I can be indoors, 15% capacity, have way more than 10 people indoors, following all the rules in worship. But as soon as I step outside our doors in the open air and the sunshine and everything else and more distancing, we can only have 10, or we got to be in our cars. That's her argument. That's what she's saying, and she holds to that. So a lot of us, I can't believe what I'm saying. So we kept coming back to her and asking her again and again, are you right? Do you want to change your position?
At this time, your question about outdoor services and whether or not they're allowed, we do certainly have a provision right now for drive-in services for any faith groups that want to have drive-in services. There is no limit on the number of people that can attend with drive-in services. If you wanted to have an outdoor service where people came and sat in a chair or on the ground in an outdoor setting, we would have to, I think, take that away. Right now we do have a limit in terms of social gatherings for up to 10 people. And that's, again, because the challenge when you get people together, especially who've been apart for a long time, it's just so difficult to ensure that people are staying that 2 meters distance all the time. And so right now, I would encourage you, if you're considering having a larger service, to consider setting up a drive-in type service event where there would be no limits and you could have people coming to that location in their cars. The final question about, or your first question about restaurants and whether or not you could serve food after the service and have it count as a restaurant. Two things I would note. One is that in a restaurant, the requirement is that it's only people in the same household who sit at the same table. And so it would depend what kind of food you're thinking of serving. I know in many locations it's more of a stand-up snack type food that's served. If you're thinking of a formal meal where people are actually sitting down and eating a full meal together, then that's currently, again, what's that restaurant format. We're not currently, it's not part of our current faith-based guidance to allow meals to happen or food to be served in church before or after, again, because typically that's part of a socialization that happens where people from different households are mixing and mingling. And so the purpose, I guess, where restaurants are open so people from the same household can go in, eat their meal, and leave again at different times from others, In a church, the difference is people are there for the service. They're all going out of that service at the same time, and if they're all going to have food together, obviously they're not wearing masks while they're doing that, and so there is a risk, again, of some of that socialization and mixing. So it is a different activity, which is why it's treated differently at this point in time.
So we couldn't believe what she was saying, that 15% of capacity indoors, you could drop it to 10 if you go outdoors, or you could go in your cars. And she was asked repeatedly about that. And the very fact that she's been asked repeatedly about that tells me that a lot of us ministers just couldn't believe what we were hearing. It just made no sense at all. But you heard her argument there. Her assumptions is about how we behave. She assumed that we've been meeting all together, 15% capacity inside the church building all winter long, and as soon as we go outside, we just can't fight the urge to hug each other and shake hands because it's spring. That's what she's saying. She's literally saying that we won't be able to control ourselves, and that's why we have to take that away from you. That's the words she used, take it away from you and cap it at 10 people. You can't be trusted. So this illustrates, once again, just one example of many things where people who are passing rules regarding businesses and organizations like churches and so on, what they can and cannot do, without ever understanding what businesses are like or what they're doing or what the reality on the front line is, often lead to nonsensical decisions, because that's not what's happening. That isn't what is taking place. And we can meet outside in a far more safety and providing a real world needs outdoors than we can indoors. It's as simple as that. Even the serving of food, I won't even get into that, but her assumptions around that are not valid. She's making broad statements that do not apply to local situations. And this has always been the problem all the way through in the emergency response, is when you make broad decisions to specific local situations, it just doesn't make sense anymore. It needs to be responsive to what's actually happening on the ground, to what is actually taking place, rather than what you speculate or assume is taking place somewheres in a central office of Alberta. So these are the changes that are taking place and the charges that are being laid against churches and why we're being treated the way we are. I wish the government would take time to actually talk to us and not give us pronouncements, put names on us as being irresponsible if we don't do what they say or disagree with their positions. It would be better to be treated like adults. And here's one of the main points we get from this. Freedom requires responsibility. And so when I've been given freedom of religion and freedom of thought, freedom of speech, I need to be responsible in how I practice my religion, how I practice my speech, and how do I practice how I run my business or anything else. I need to be responsible for that and take personal responsibility of that. And when it works best is when that responsibility flows from good moral character, self-discipline, a guiding principle, as we find from the Word of God, from the Bible. But if you decide that I'm being irresponsible and I'm not treating my freedom correctly, and then you decide because of that you're justified in taking my freedoms away, you now become responsible. Forever who takes my freedom away now becomes responsible, no longer me. I'm not responsible. The government's responsible because they took my freedoms. And when the government is responsible, then they have to be accountable for everything that follows. The loss of jobs, loss of lives, loss of work, the discouragement, the suicidal thoughts. We're no longer responsible for that. The government is. Why? Because they took our freedoms away. If you want us to be partners, to work with you during a crisis, whether it's COVID or the next crisis that comes along. Don't take our freedoms away. Instead, invite us to cooperate, to work with you. Make your case. Make a good case. Show us the science. Show us the reality. And keep showing us and keep talking to us so that we can exercise our freedoms and be responsible at the same time. You're going to get a lot more cooperation and a lot more respect from us when you do it that way. But when it comes down to threats, and fines, and jail, and name-calling, irresponsible, you're going to lose our respect as you take away our freedoms and our ability to be responsible participants in the social contract as citizens of this country and of this province. Those are just some of my thoughts. You might not agree. You might agree. You can leave a comment below in the comments section. But I'm so glad you joined us for this ongoing discussion. And there's nothing wrong with good discussion and exploring the reality of it. I am so looking forward to this court case when it will go to trial. Oh, it will be a beautiful thing, because never before has the government had to make their case in court. And I thank Pastor Coates for making this possible. Hey, this has been Pastor John from Millerville Community Church, encouraging you as always to keep the faith and to share it too.
Come escape the city. Come to God's country. Come to God's people. Come to God's Word. Welcome to Millerville Community Church. We're just a short drive away.